For years, Arizona looked like the answer. If you were priced out of California, Arizona was the solution. If you were tired of Midwest winters, Arizona was calling. If you were an investor looking for the next growth market, Arizona was where the money was moving. New subdivisions were rising faster than the desert dust could settle. Prices were climbing quarter after quarter. Migration numbers were breaking records. Builders could not pour foundations fast enough to meet demand. The story was simple, clean, and extremely convincing. But underneath that story, there was always a variable that the headlines were not discussing loudly enough. Water, not interest rates, not affordability, not even economic cycles. Water, the single most fundamental physical constraint on human settlement in a desert environment. And right now, in certain Arizona cities, that constraint is beginning to intersect with housing markets in ways that are just starting to become visible in the data. Permit pauses, development delays, supply projections being quietly revised downward. Long-term groundwater sustainability reviews that are changing what builders can build and where. Today, we are counting down 10 Arizona cities where water risk is beginning to create real housing vulnerability. And as we move toward number one, the severity of that intersection intensifies. Let's establish the context first, because the individual city stories only make sense against the statewide backdrop. Arizona's growth model was built on a few foundational assumptions. First, that population inflow from higher cost states would continue driving demand. Second, that land availability and relative affordability would sustain builder activity. Third, that water, while a known variable in a desert state, was a manageable one. That third assumption is now under significant pressure. The Colorado River, which supplies a substantial portion of Arizona's water, has been operating under Tier 1 and Tier 2 shortage declarations as Lake Mead levels have declined. Groundwater sustainability requirements have tightened. Arizona's assured water supply rules, which required developers to demonstrate a 100-year water supply before receiving residential permits, are being applied with increasing scrutiny. Some areas that received approvals based on groundwater modeling are now seeing those models revisited as actual depletion data comes in. Here's why this matters for housing specifically. Housing markets can absorb high interest rates. They can adjust to affordability ceilings. They can work through inventory cycles. What they struggle to navigate is structural uncertainty. When buyers, builders, insurers, and lenders all begin pricing in an unknown, that unknown becomes a drag on confidence. And confidence is what housing markets run on. When confidence shifts, the repricing that follows can be sharper and more durable than a standard cyclical correction. That is the backdrop. Now let's move across the state. Starting at number 10, Mesa. Mesa is an established suburb with a diverse housing stock and a strong migration inflow that held through the rate environment better than many comparable markets. The boom years of 2020 through 2022 produced rapid appreciation here, and Mesa has generally been viewed as one of the more resilient parts of the valley. But what is showing up now is inventory, normalization, and slowing absorption rates in certain segments, particularly in the expansion corridors on Mesa's outer edges. Those corridors rely more heavily on groundwater than Mesa's core. And as surrounding areas face supply review processes, pressure is beginning to build at the margins. The risk here is manageable for now, but the edges are worth watching. Moving to number 9, Chandler. Chandler rode a tech employment narrative through the boom with some of the valley's highest end subdivisions and strong demand from semiconductor and corporate relocation activity. The challenge Chandler is now facing is a collision between premium pricing and an affordability ceiling that the rate environment has made significantly lower. The peripheral growth zones in Chandler face increasing scrutiny on long-term water supply. And when you combine high price sensitivity with infrastructure strain at the edges of development, you create a market that can decelerate quickly if confidence softens. The core of Chandler remains relatively insulated, but the outer growth rings are showing early stress indicators. Number 8 is Peoria. Peoria was one of the West Valley's master-planned community success stories, with new developments drawing buyers who wanted larger lots and newer construction at prices slightly below the Southeast Valley. What is showing up now is rising days on market and a noticeable uptick in seller concessions in the newer subdivisions. The critical water factor here is that Peoria's expansion corridors, the areas where the newest development is concentrated, are facing supply review delays that are beginning to affect permit timelines. When permit timelines extend, builder confidence softens, speculative inventory accumulates, and the pricing momentum that drove the market starts losing its engine. Number 7 is Surprise. The name is appropriate because Surprise built its entire growth identity around being an affordable entry point for migrants who could not access Phoenix pricing. That affordability advantage has been fading. Inventory is rising, absorption is slowing, and the long-term groundwater modeling for Surprise's growth zones is being scrutinized more aggressively than the development pace of the past several years would suggest was planned for. The peripheral subdivisions that were built on the assumption of continued groundwater availability are the most exposed here, because if that availability is revised downward, the value proposition that drove demand in those specific areas weakens significantly. This is the midpoint of the countdown, and the tone needs to shift here, because from this point forward, we are no longer talking about soft deceleration. We are talking about structural fragility. Number 6, Goodyear. Goodyear has been one of the most aggressive development stories in the entire West Valley, with massive community projects and significant infrastructure investment driving a growth narrative that attracted both end buyers and investors. What is changing now is the regulatory environment around permits. Scrutiny is increasing. Groundwater modeling requirements are becoming more aggressive. And when you have a market that was built around the assumption of continued permit approvals at scale, any meaningful slowdown in that approval pipeline compresses builder margins, reduces new supply confidence, and introduces exactly the kind of uncertainty that makes buyers pause. Number 5, Queen Creek. If you want to understand the Arizona exurban growth story at its most concentrated, Queen Creek is the case study. Explosive lot development, large format master planned communities, and a buyer profile that skewed toward families seeking space and value in a desert landscape. The water factor in Queen Creek is significant. Heavy groundwater reliance combined with long infrastructure pipelines means that the cost and complexity of sustaining growth in this market increases as the easy groundwater gets used. Spec build inventory is rising. If the growth model that drove Queen Creek's expansion begins to face supply constraints, the repricing risk in the newer outer segments is material. Number 4, Buckeye. Buckeye made national headlines as one of the fastest growing cities in the entire United States. The scale of development here was extraordinary, and the investor concentration that accompanied it was equally significant. But Buckeye also made a different kind of headline when development moratorium discussions surfaced around water supply concerns and assured water supply compliance questions for certain projects. That headline matters not just for what it said about specific projects, but for what it did to investor psychology in the broader market. Inventory growth in Buckeye has been accelerating. If water confidence in this market experiences any further decline, the demand repricing could happen faster than the gradual inventory accumulation might suggest. Number 3, Casa Grande. Casa Grande built its recent growth story on an industrial and logistics expansion narrative. New facilities, distribution infrastructure, and the jobs that accompany that kind of economic activity drew attention from investors and buyers who saw an underpriced market with a genuine economic catalyst behind it. The stress that is emerging now reflects a combination of factors. Remote location creates a thinner buyer pool. Affordability has stretched relative to income levels. And the water dynamics here involve a complicated transition from agricultural to residential use that creates uncertainty about long-term supply allocation. The speculative positioning in this market is heavy, and thinner buyer pools combined with structural water questions create a repricing environment that can move quickly. Number 2, Maricopa. Maricopa exists in the Phoenix Metro's orbit as an affordable overflow valve. When Phoenix got expensive, Maricopa absorbed buyers who wanted new construction at accessible price points and were willing to accept a longer commute. The problem is that the commute fatigue issue is now compounding with other pressures. Investor ownership concentration in Maricopa is high, which creates a market that is disproportionately sensitive to shifts in investor sentiment. Groundwater sustainability reviews are intensifying specifically in this area, and the inventory growth rate in Maricopa, measured against absorption, is among the sharpest of any mid-tier city in the state. High price sensitivity, heavy investor exposure, and active water supply review is a combination that creates significant downside risk if any of those variables moves unfavorably. And that brings us to number 1, Scottsdale. Specifically, the peripheral development zones at Scottsdale's outer boundaries, where high-end desert expansion has been pushing into territory that is increasingly water transport dependent and infrastructure cost intensive. The conventional narrative on Scottsdale is that luxury markets are insulated, that premium buyers are less rate sensitive, that the Scottsdale brand sustains demand regardless of broader market conditions. That narrative holds in the core. It is the peripheral expansion zones where the risk calculus changes significantly. Here is the dynamic that makes Scottsdale's outer growth areas the most structurally concerning point on this countdown. When water risk intersects with luxury pricing, what happens first is a liquidity freeze. High dollar markets do not correct gradually in uncertain environments. They pause. Sellers refuse to reduce prices because the assets are too large to liquidate at a loss without significant consequences. Buyers step back because the premium being paid requires certainty that uncertainty eliminates. Volume collapses before price moves, and when volume collapses in a high-end market, the eventual price discovery, when it comes, can be violent because the pent-up repricing has nowhere gradual to land. This is not a prediction of collapse. Let me be clear about that. What we are describing is a repricing risk environment, one where structural uncertainty about a fundamental resource begins to function as a pricing variable across an entire market ecosystem. But repricing is not the same as a correction. Repricing can be structural, and structural repricing, once it begins, does not reverse on a normal cycle. Think about the chain of consequences. If builders slow permitting activity because groundwater approvals become uncertain, new supply compresses. If financing tightens because lenders begin pricing in resource risk, buyer capacity shrinks. If insurance costs increase, as they have begun to do in climate-adjacent risk markets across the country, total ownership cost rises independently of purchase price. If population inflow slows because the narrative of Arizona as an unlimited growth destination begins to fade, demand loses its primary engine. Each of those variables operates on the others. They compound. Arizona saw one of the most concentrated investor surges of any state during the pandemic-era housing expansion. Short-term rental purchases, build-to-rent communities, speculative lot acquisitions in expansion zones, all of it concentrated significant investor capital into markets that are now showing the early signs of the stress we have been describing. And the critical thing to understand about investor-heavy markets is that investors exit faster than owner occupants. When the risk-reward calculation shifts, institutional and semi-institutional money moves quickly. That movement amplifies volatility in markets that would otherwise correct more gradually. This is also not 2008. The structural drivers are different. The 2008 collapse was fundamentally a credit event. Lending standards had been so degraded that the underlying assets could not support the debt placed against them. And when that became clear, the credit system that had inflated the market withdrew simultaneously. What we are looking at in Arizona is a different mechanism. It is resource constraint, intersecting with rate normalization and the psychological recalibration that follows any period of extraordinary appreciation. The trigger is different, but housing corrections do not require identical triggers. They require one thing: confidence erosion. And confidence erodes when a fundamental assumption about a market's long-term viability begins to be questioned. The variables worth watching from here are specific. Permit approval timelines in the outer growth corridors. Builder incentive levels, which reveal where demand has softened enough to require margin compression. Days on market trends in the exurban and peripheral segments. Migration data, particularly whether the California and out-of-state inflow that drove the boom is maintaining its volume. Water infrastructure announcements, which will signal whether supply challenges are being met with genuine solutions or managed with optimistic projections. And insurance pricing in desert development zones, which has historically been an early indicator of structural risk being repriced before the broader market absorbs it. None of this happens all at once. Housing markets move slowly until they do not. The signals we have been describing today are early. The data is not at crisis levels, but the pattern and the structural logic underneath it is worth taking seriously before it becomes obvious. Arizona's housing boom was built on growth. That growth was built on migration. That migration was built on affordability, sunshine, and the assumption of abundant space with sufficient resources. But underneath all of it lies a simpler, harder, more uncompromising variable: water. Markets can adapt to rate cycles. They can work through inventory corrections. They can absorb policy changes and economic fluctuations and demographic shifts. They cannot negotiate with physics. When a desert market's water supply projections are revised downward, that revision does not move in the other direction easily. It creates a permanent recalibration of what sustainable development in that environment looks like. And that recalibration, once it moves from technical reports into buyer psychology, changes the market. Watch the edges, because housing markets do not unravel from the center. They unravel from exactly where we started this countdown. The peripheral zones, the growth corridors, the places where the expansion was most aggressive and the infrastructure assumptions were most optimistic. That is where the foundation is thinnest, and that is where the first cracks are already showing.